So as we kind of talked a little bit offline, I kind of mentioned how like I thought it was a funny callback to The Empire Strikes Back when Darth Vader promotes one of his staff, kind of in a moment, because here in Brave New World, Mustapha Mond turns to Bernard after Henry's dead and stuff, and just basically explains how it's critical that he takes control. There isn't much time, director. Kind of just basically that's like the Empire's way of promoting you when you're given the role and then just basically given the new title all at once without much pomp and circumstance.
I guess the only difference would be in this one, they're conditioned to not be afraid of dying, right? So they just carry on with things as they go. It's even more seamless than the Empire in that respect.
Right.
But yeah. No, the other thing I was talking previously about John's journey and how he does this kind of whole cycle of fame to obscurity and this sort of reflection. I kind of in a way there's this kind of weird vicarious thrill when you're watching it, in that we're so sort of hyper individualized in our society that everyone is trying to be different from everyone else. So the idea that you could stand out so easily just by sort of being a bit challenging is kind of a bit of a sort of a power trip in a world like in today's world. It's kind of, you get this vicarious thrill by watching him, which is kind of interesting. But again, kind of like the 98 version, I don't think that's necessarily in the spirit of the book, in that the characters latch on to this kind of difference of him and the novelty, because a lot of the things he's sort of putting forward challenges the stability of the society. And if you think about how they're conditioned in the book, the society, they're doing everything for the sake of the society. The society more or less represents their parents. So they would have a much stronger emotional tie to the status quo than the characters would in the 98 or the 2020, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah.
The only other thing,
Oh, I was going to say though, and that's a key theme that I'll definitely we'll definitely talk more about it. But it's this idea that like how much of a body or government or whatever else should be a parent and stuff like that. And I feel like that is a reflection about like a theme that is in our current world and stuff. So
yeah. One last thing about the whole kind of savage lands and the vacation thing and how that kind of ties into inequality, which I thought was this really sort of almost emphasizes like a neo-feudalism. And it reminded me of how, if you see the alphas as like the ultra wealthy in this, they're not only shielding themselves from the poverty and the strife of all the things they talk about with monogamy and jealousy and everything else, but they're also kind of shielding themselves from, emotional pain and love. And it reminded me, sort of very sidetracky, but there's a Dan Bilzerian Instagram post where he shows this T-shirt that one of his friends has made, which says, "Poor people make love, rich people, F word," inserted there.
Right.
And I thought, if that isn't like the kind of the alpha Brave New World kind of thing, it's like if you are wealthy enough, you can actually kind of remove yourself from the realities of the human experience almost.
Right.
And it really reminded me of that whole kind of sequence, especially with the orgies in the hotel and stuff.
And to me, what's really strange though, bizarre, is that like that kind of statement gets into the very idea that we talk about on some other shows of how like kind of when you get down to it, sociopaths and psychopaths, right, have this attitude that like, oh, they're above like kind of what the rest of us should feel and stuff. They should not have to like deal with the messiness of like kind of that's breakups or this or that and everything. It's just like kind of just move on.
Yeah, and I mean, there is this sort of, obviously a clear sort of lack of empathy in all of the alphas when they go and visit the Savage Reserve, which is much more emphasized in this, in comparison to the 98 version. But of course, they're not trying to achieve anything. There's, apart from Bernard, who's ambitious and is perhaps a little more sociopathic than the rest of them. But I mean, their main thing is just to, perpetuate the status quo, which I suppose you could also kind of levy at the ultra wealthy at the moment. They probably don't want to change things too much. But yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting sort of take on that. Another thing, another character that we haven't really talked about yet, is, because there's sort of a new character in this, is Mustapha Mond and Indra, kind of almost like an interchangeable character in this one,
right,
unlike the others.
Yeah, I guess we should explain that, like, in this world, apparently Indra, even though, like, again, I thought it was interesting how you were saying, the creator didn't want to have a baddie and stuff, but I feel like, just kind of like Westworld, there is this, AI called Indra here that ends up being, not only architect of the world, but also in some ways the kind of, baddie, if you will. That, but I would say though that, like, it's a lot more in the background than Westworld. Westworld definitely, is very much in the forefront. So that, I think that's one key difference though.
Yeah, I think it's also this kind of commentary, like, Indra is like the child of Mustapha Mond in this one. So she's like a child that can't deal with the changing society, so she just kills everyone and starts again. It's kind of like the thing. It's like a spoiled kind of toddler in a way, and that's not a totally kind of new idea that AI would behave very reactionarily, like a toddler that's can't deal with it.
We certainly saw that with Dolores as she kind of evolved in the series and stuff. So it's interesting how. That is something that we see over and over again in sci-fi, is the idea of AI being like you said, a child. And also, another funny kind of similarities, again, lacking in empathy and stuff like that, and kind of having very sociopathic, psychopathic tendencies. So that's another kind of weird connection to all the things we've been just talking about as well.
Absolutely. And it seems like, there's a lot of stories where AI can't understand the complexities of humans, so it's easy just to kill them. I kind of even feel like HAL in 2001 is a bit like that. It's just like, you guys are getting...
I was just thinking about that.
You're going on weird trips now. It's easy just to cut the cord, let you float down to space, and I can start again somewhere. But and I think that is a sort of a reflection of... I also feel it's kind of a reflection of how we often paint the bad guy in the modern sort of technological world. And like it used to be kind of like in the 90s it was conspiracy theories, and it's like the evil elite are the ones screwing up society. Now it's AI is like the obvious bad guy we point the finger to. So yeah.
And what did you think of the subplot though? Because I felt like like normally it's the AI kind of going muck and then like kind of revolting and stuff, right? Like we had in Westworld. Here we have like kind of the gammas and like kind of the lower classes kind of basically almost like artificial life that goes amok, like it almost felt like that kind of reflection, that the fact that like, okay, you can kind of use them as your worker bee / almost disposable kind of people in the world, but at some point they may kind of wake up and go, hey, why am I putting up with this, and just kind of like robots.
Absolutely. I think that there's two ways you can sort of interpret the Epsilon revolution, which was an interesting difference as well from any of the other previous versions and the book. I mean, I see that more of a statement on the post-truth world, and the idea that, Epsilons are heavily conditioned and are supposed to be less intelligent. So for me, that's a statement on like, less intelligent people are more easily conditioned by whatever they take in and will react unpredictably or violently based purely on what they see. Because like in the 98 version, we had a Delta who was purposefully being programmed by, an elite person. In this, we've got the less intelligent people just sort of observing things and interpreting them under their own kind of logic that causes the downfall of society. So it's kind of that I felt it was just like, the danger of creating people who are artificially stupid basically means they'll be more easily influenced and cause problems for your society. But you're right, though, you could also interpret it as like you create machines that aren't particularly intelligent, and they could do something really stupid and cause problems as well. It kind of can swing both ways with that.
I mean, I felt like what it kind of is a reflection of is that, like, you know, whether it's factories in China or you know, like kind of the blue collar classes that we kind of create because there is the demand for, you know, workers, right, and stuff, that at some point, you know, they may kind of wake up and go, you know, like, really, you know, this is kind of effed up that I'm working for crumbs and, you know, like kind of, and meanwhile I'm making these, you know, kind of, you know, toys and whatever else for consumption of the wealthy and everything, and making their life great and stuff like that. But meanwhile, you know, I'm going back to my, you know, like kind of, and as we saw with, you know, C-Jack 60, and who was actually a direct emulation, I guess, apparently, of one of the core founders of this, you know, society, Elliot. You know, as it turned out, you know, again, major spoiler, you know, later on and stuff. But I felt like, you know, like the reason why he kind of woke up was the fact that, you know, like, yeah, he suddenly kind of, you know, saw that, like, you know, he is living in this kind of, you know, lack of a better way to put it, you know, shithole of a place and stuff like that. And meanwhile, like, kind of just, you know, daily going through these routines. And then, you know, along comes John, right? Kind of, you know, basically showing him, like, you know, hey, you know, wake up and stuff, you know, you kind of, and, you know, it's, I think that's sometimes a reflection of, like, you know, maybe, you know, like in our society as it is, in like, you know, that we have like kind of these structures and stuff, at some point, you know, there's bound to be like kind of these workers kind of waking up to, like, you know, with like the next revolutionary, right, the next you know, whether it's, you know, Cuba, you know, like kind of, or what's called Che Guevara, you know, like kind of somebody kind of basically, you know, saying, you know, hey, why are you putting up with this, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the point of that kind of stuff was that, you know, the Epsilons are not given any kind of training on how to use critical thinking. You know, they're just supposed to accept whatever they see. So it kind of shows this danger without giving people the tools of critical thinking. When exposed to new things, they may just go along and interpret it in very dangerous ways.
Right.
But I mean, yeah. But also, I would say it doesn't. No, sorry. Go on.
No, I was gonna say that is really true in the fact that, like, you know, because John, you know, like kind of, you know, his thing was, you know, he wasn't telling him to kind of kill people and kind of revolt, you know, like kind of that way and stuff like that. He was just saying, wake up, and like kind of, you know, so his message, like kind of, you know, like I said, got distorted or without the critical thinking and stuff, that it just, or it became interpreted as like, you know, kill the oppressors, you know, like kind of.
Yeah, very kind of like, us versus their modern take on that relationship. But in a way, it's kind of, I don't really feel that's keeping in spirit of the book, or what made, you know, the Epsilon so insidious in the book is the fact that they are so well conditioned that they don't ever question what they're doing, you know, and they don't even have the capacity to do so, which is probably the scary thing about the book.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly made for like exciting, you know, scenes for a television series.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean, you know, if we were true to the book, then, like, you know, that would never happen. Like, I mean, that's not the world, you know, like kind of that Aldous Huxley created.
No. Yeah, and I mean, the technology, as we've sort of touched on, the technology is the big difference in this one from any of the previous versions. I mean, in this one, you've got there's a sort of, I guess you could sort of say, and, you know, comparison to social media, in the connections that people make are mediated or sort of edited, and so that's not real social connection. Also there's this kind of technological engineering of relationships. You have these sort of matching algorithms that are built into their kind of system, which is also this, you know, Indra is this all-pervasive kind of Orwellian system where it can view anything through anyone's eyes, very much like the Thought Police in 1984. And so, you know, anyone can see through anyone's eyes, which is this kind of enforced empathy, but there's no privacy, of course. And just like it's an interesting interpretation, because Aldous Huxley in the book says that, you know, you kind of need to be isolated to reflect and, you know, take your own creative or kind of search for truth journey. Whereas in this, it's kind of like, you know, you need the privacy in order to kind of keep yourself sane in a non-soma induced state, it seems. But also this idea that you're being punished for being offline, and it's your duty to be always online, you know.
Yeah,
basically.
I mean, and that's really like kind of, you know, our internet / you know, smartphone driven world, right? Like that people like criticize you if you don't have your cell phone at the beck and ready, you know, turned on, you know, like kind of tuned in, you know, like kind of, yeah,
and more from a cultural perspective, it seems like, you know, you have to be always up to date with everything and online in order to stay relevant and to
post things on social media
and relevancy equals revenue, right? So you know, that's the look, I'm starting to sound like an alpha marketing engineer there for a minute. But and I think, I mean, certainly privacy is something, again, that I think we will lose it, you know. Make no bones about it. There's already like movements, because of course child pornography in the last sort of 7 or 8 years or whatever has gone through the roof, and that's because there's, you know, various more encrypted forms of being able to pass this stuff around. So eventually when more of this becomes in the public consciousness, there'll be a backlash and say, okay, we actually need less privacy so we can catch, you know, these people or things like this. So I think, you know, you'll see a lot of that go, basically.
I wonder also if you know, something, you know, not necessarily like child pornography, but like just other things, as time goes on, you know, it's like where we kind of deregulate more and more, right? Like take marijuana being the most recent major case in point, that that's going to just be a natural function of like kind of, you know, as things evolve and stuff like that. And the reason why I bring that up is also like, I feel like some of the things that we see, you know, just even like soma, for example, like it becomes like, it's like nobody's getting a prescription. It's just something that like is, you know, like kind of dispensed, right, and stuff like that. So that's an interesting commentary about how like they're picturing a future, right, where, you know, I mean, having ecstasy, I mean, to some degree, even, you know, ecstasy was just readily available. I mean, granted, it was underground and stuff like that, but, you know, if you wanted to, it was really not that hard to get it and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we're moving more towards that world. You know, there's already, you know, I mean, I'm sure it's very beneficial, but, you know, there's hallucinogens, the natural ones are now being sort of prescribed for PTSD and various other sort of psychological problems. But, you know that at some point there will be a more synthetic version that is that doesn't keep people out of work for 8 to 10 hours while they're tripping or something like that. You know, it's kind of like a 10-minute trip that allows you to get back to work and things like this. So, or just irons out those sort of personality flaws. So yeah, it's you can definitely see that sort of getting more and more refined.
So before we kind of dive deeper into the different ideas and stuff like that, so which of the three do you feel like kind of is going to hold up the best over time and stuff?
Well, I actually really like the 2020 version. And actually there's one, of course, we've left out one major character from the 2020 version. The main character, Lenina, right?
Yeah.
We haven't even talked about Lenina.
Great time to discuss it. Yeah.
We better before. So, yeah, I mean, I thought that was a really interesting change, having Lenina not only as like a central character, but also making her the kind of the agent of change in a lot of this story. In that, you know, she's basically, we start off with her, she's looking for, and we kind of see it through her relationships. You know, we see her, you know, really getting attached to Henry Foster.
Right.
And that really starts her journey of being an outsider, because she's too attached to him, you know. And then she's forced to look elsewhere, but wants something outside of the norm. So goes for Bernard. And, you know, Bernard So she's gone from her idealized man to someone who offers her a different perspective. And then we sort of, I suppose we see her dealing with all the sort of the difference and change and the traumas of the savage lands.
Right.
And then she sort of, by discarding the soma, finds this sort of personal strength where she starts exploring different sort of aspects and challenging the society. And, starts to sort of push Henry around, which I thought was an interesting scene where she tries to, so she's now sort of empowered and challenging the status quo, and now tries to change her idealized man to a form that she actually prefers. And then she realizes that's not really helping, and he's never going to sort of change. And then she ends up with John, who's someone who actually lets her be herself, and she sort of discovers her own sort of journey and sort of emotional, gets in touch with her own sort of emotional path through that, through him, which was really interesting. So yeah, I mean, it's a bit sort of cynical that her journey seems to be actually dictated by the men she's with, but it was interesting nonetheless.
And I think like you kind of talked about it to some degree, that like she's definitely not just an accessory character. I feel like there's always a love triangle in these different stories and different versions, but out of the three, this is definitely one. The 2020 series definitely where she's a lot more developed. We definitely see her world, and like kind of the thing that she contends with as a beta plus and stuff. That on the one hand, like kind of she's conditioned to be happy, in this world where she's oversexed and stuff like that. But then, like kind of, over the, like you said, over the course of the journey, we see that like that she's not only seeing that there's another way, but she starts asking questions. Like that's I think like kind of one of the things that we really don't see at all in any other versions. And then that we also have the space to see that like she's besides having a mind and stuff like that, she's like kind of like, why is this way? And she's asking like kind of the deeper stuff and everything. And maybe part of it is like you said, like kind of just the influence of like the different men in her life and stuff like that. But I don't think I don't think it's necessarily bad that that's the reason, because I think ultimately that's what's interesting is that like, and by no means am I a feminism expert stuff, but I feel like that like to show that like, we that a woman has something to gain from a relationship with a man, I don't think it's a bad thing. I feel like, sometimes the extreme feminist attitude is that like, men don't have anything to offer. Like kind of, I feel like it's just like as damaging as the idea that like, like kind of men are the sole source of anything to kind of, of value for for a woman and stuff. I feel like to say that they have no value to a woman is just like just as bad, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you're right. I think that's right. It's I guess that's part of the overriding message is that monogamy is not such a bad thing. That's kind of one of the messages. But also, I mean, it's a fairly new phenomenon, I would say, in most sort of TV and movies to have a female protagonist who sleeps with lots of people who you're also supposed to sympathize with and kind of follow on a journey, Yeah. And this one has this complexity in that she's sleeping with lots of people, but not necessarily who she wants to, because she's somewhat sort of obliged to do so, but she's also kind of, so that's kind of an interesting balance that she has to sort of do. It ultimately doesn't work out for her, but yeah.
And I feel like that is a statement of like kind of the quote unquote modern woman, right? Because the character from Sex and the City, right? That's one of the things that we see with her is that like there's a bit of a pressure, by society and everything like that to, sleep with different, kind of men to kind of find out who she is and all that kind of stuff. Even though that ultimately she ends up in monogamy, like kind of, so I think it's an interesting kind of reflection that we see in, kind of a quote unquote more modern, take on the female story and stuff like that. And I mean, I think that's what's kind of also interesting is that like in the end though, monogamy is still the thing that like is promoted as like kind of, you know, the good, I guess, if you will, and stuff. That I think that's like a not necessarily a Puritan kind of value, but it's interesting how like that is still like the thing that like where we're not quite ready for Brave New World, I guess.
No, and I think but it leaves you in an interesting place there, this series, because you kind of see John yearning for that kind of monogamy or monogamous relationship. You see her moving on to something as yet undisclosed, which was you know, maybe something new. Maybe she goes back to him, you know. It's or maybe she just maybe she becomes the director of an entirely new sort of colony. Or I think that would have been the interesting sort of direction had they made a second series. Is I kind of get the feeling they would have just found a slightly different colony that had different you know, different sort of quirks, but still a very kind of systemized way of living. But who knows, right?
But what did you think of the idea that Indra going into the Savage Lands, right, to kind of basically take that over? I mean, that seemed like kind of what they were alluding to. Yeah,
I think that's obviously that would sort of touch back on almost Westworld territory of like, you know, how AI can dominate a more primitive society more easily or something like that. But it kind of made me feel, Indra was a little bit sort of bit of Matrix and a bit of sort of Westworld sort of thrown together. The most interesting thing for me about Indra and actually the world controllers is something that's kind of only mentioned in a sort of small sentence in the book, and that is that there's 10 world controllers. And you finally see me now, all the lights have gone off. The decanting station is now turned off for the night now. You know, there's these 10 controllers, each of their own sort of separate colonies. And you know, you actually see this underground sort of station with the 10 sort of individuals who presumably each one has their own, you know, colony that they've shaped in their own kind of image. They're kind of like the 10 gods or something like this. But the interesting thing about that sort of imagery, though, is it reminds me of the anime on Netflix called Knights of Sidonia, which is kind of a similar sort of Brave New World thing, but it's about sort of a spacefaring, genetically engineered nation that's I can't remember what they're trying to sort of fight using big robots against an undisclosed sort of giant alien race, very kind of typical giant mech kind of anime subject matter. But there are 10 sort of immortal world controllers who are kind of perpetually controlling the society in this underground thing, and there's just one sort of female controller who's you know, dictating what's happening in that particular space. And in that one, they also sorry, more spoilers, but they kind of if I didn't interpret this incorrectly, it seems like they turned off all of the 10 people at the end. So there was something similar in that as well. It was almost like for like that scene. So that was kind of interesting. And
also for me harkens back to Battlestar Galactica, you know, kind of the final 6, and so you know, and again also like that, you know, where the final 5 whatever, like kind of they also duplicate themselves, right, and stuff. And so I mean, I'm kind of curious like how much of that was like kind of the influence and the, you know, and again like, guess, you know, probably who's to say, right, like kind of, you know, how much of it like kind of was him being a fan of that series of stuff.
I actually like the fact that in some respects there's only going to be one season, because that obviously is all the stuff that's based on the book, and they're not going to try and I'm obviously just going to get disappointed by whatever season 2 throws my way. It's inevitable. But I think though I did enjoy it, I thought it was really good. And as I say, I mean, there were just some great scenes. I mean, how often do you get to watch someone punch someone out in an orgy? You know, there's not many TV shows where you get to watch that. So that was really good.
And just like moments like that were just done like kind of very like, you know, tongue in cheek, and kind of it just kind of like, even though like you said, it was like kind of a memorable moment, but it was also like kind of done in like kind of just like a funny moment that like kind of really, it was unexpected, and also like kind of just really, you know, even though like Brave New World, we tend to think of it as like a serious sci-fi kind of, you know, thing and stuff like that. But there's just like these moments that like kind of really convey humor, whether, you know, and I think it's intentional, because like you know, I talked about offline. I think it's, you know, kind of very self-aware and wasn't like kind of taking itself too seriously.
Yeah, and I mean, it was a very self-reflective show as well, because I mean, I kind of see it as, Grant Morrison has gone from being a fairly obscure comic book writer to someone who's now being hired and like sort of a darling of TV, it seems, and he's being asked to do all sorts of things. So I'm sure he's experienced that kind of cycle of fame and being the hot thing and stuff like that. So, that was really interesting to see that whole done, that whole sort of cycle done in such a encapsulated way. And likewise, Bernard's ambitions, it does make you sort of ask, am I creative, or work ambitions purely from going from a gamma to a beta? I start sort of being very kind of, makes you feel this is all pretty pointless, really, when you watch it. But I kind of like that about it. I kind of like things that question your own kind of state of mind about where you're going with things. So.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great transition to like, what overall, like between the series and the different versions of stuff and the book, like there's just so many kind of deeper kind of topics that like we've kind of touched on. And we'll kind of try to do it within a reasonable amount of time. We know that folks are maybe like kind of can only watch or listen for so long, something like that. But I feel like one of the key things I wanted to really talk about is that like here you have a society that's replaced religion, right? And and that's really one of the things that communism kind of really talked about doing, right? Because Marx kind of basically had this idea of like kind of religion is the opium of the people. So like kind of, okay, instead we're going to actually give them opium, in the form of soma and stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, it's, at the time this was written, communism was the best example of people trying to engineer society on a really large basis. It was the first time that you saw kind of education and the media all being kind of pushed as a means to a goal for the entire society. And it's there's this kind of course, what wasn't realized at the time that eventually, well, it was, but we'll get into that later. But there's this kind of oligarchy, but not so much of like royal families taking over, but it's an oligarchy of ideology and of opinion that becomes the ruling power in communism. And I think that's what they really tapped into with Brave New World, was this idea of scientific rationalization of how society should work.
And I think because of Huxley being kind of in that time moment and stuff like that, and the things that are going on, I think the ironic part is that meanwhile you have this thing called Nazi Germany happening that is, on the one hand, is supposed to be the counter to communism, the things that was going on, but in the end, both whether nationalism or socialism use the same things of controlling media and basically wanting to kind of orchestrate the world kind of in their image and stuff like that. So to me, like, and on top of all that, like kind of the Nazis they're really like kind of notorious for the fact that they not only profess to kind of heading towards eugenics, but they were actively looking to kind of do that and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think why this is alluded to in Brave New World, and also as the thing that actually inspired, when I did some more reading, I found that Brave New World is heavily inspired by Bertrand Russell's The Scientific Outlook, I think. He definitely adds his own, Brave New World has its own sort of interesting ideas, but there's this idea that Darwinism can be misinterpreted. And that's how you get, it's almost like this kind of post-truth version of Darwinism that leads to kind of racial prejudice and the Aryan idealism of the Nazi regime. And the other thing that's very powerful from that people describe from the Nazi regime is this idea of the social body, this idea that like your entire society is one sort of Aryan ideal. And the Aryan ideal, I don't think it's more about actually getting people to see each other as one kind of physical body rather than looking for blue eyes and blonde hair.
Sure.
I think it was more a kind of a symbolic thing for people to get round to identify as one unified force.
Yeah.
And that's why you also see in the 2020 version they refer to the social body, as the society.
And that's I was going to say that's okay, sure.
One last, when we talk about conditioning and how societies,
Right.
the Hitler Youth, that's why they would kind of report their parents, because the duty to the social body was more important than the familial or the parental connection.
Right.
That same sort of thing we see in Brave New World, where attachment comes second to the society.
Yeah, and to me, like I keep going back to this, but that's yet another aspect that each side vilified the other. The fascists kind of criticized the socialists for this, but both had this approach that like, oh, you're part of the bigger whole. So to me, it's almost like nowadays, like kind of here in the States, on the eve of the post eve of the election and stuff like that, it's you have the Democrats, kind of criticizing the Republicans and stuff like that, and both like kind of isn't about like kind of what's actually best for you and I. It's or you and me. It's what's best for the Republicans or what's best for the Democrats, right? As this body, this kind of amorphous kind of thing that you've got to be a part of and stuff. And if you're not, then you're the enemy and stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. It's this social collective identification. What I'm most interesting in, so I should give just a little bit of background, because there's some really interesting insights from the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell, which came out the year before, and was very much like a kind of an essay or a paper on his view of how society was moving forward. And I think what Aldous Huxley did was he basically made a kind of a fictionalized version of this paper, using a lot of some of the stuff from it, and also added in a few kind of bits of his own.
Sure.
But I mean, the Scientific Outlook sort of says that both adverts and educations will be used for propaganda. All media trends towards uniformity. So eventually you have a very homogenized kind of message that comes across in all sorts of things. And he describes, as we talked about, religion being replaced by, messaging. He sees Hollywood as like the new priests, the high priests of the new religion, which is, love, fashion, and money making, which all media trends towards uniformity. So eventually you have a very homogenized kind of message that comes across in all sorts of things. And he describes, as we talked about, religion being replaced by, messaging. He sees Hollywood as like the new priests, the high priests of the new religion, which is, love, fashion, and money making, which is exactly what we've talked about in terms of before, in that how we've sort of seen that develop. And he also says, that basically Hollywood is the perfect kind of way of making poor people more submissive, because the trope of bad guys always lose, or greedy guys always lose, kind of actually gives them this feeling of justification of things that happen in stories.
And meanwhile, like what we see over and over again in images and different things of the media and stuff is portrayal of like kind of but meanwhile what you should be doing with your money is consume, like kind of, we've talked about this in Dawn of the Dead, and like kind of that like in this kind of it's interesting that here in each of the different versions, like the way they've handled it was different, but the message was like kind of that like that a lot of the different casts, what they're all supporting is this kind of overall world, or like kind of, besides worshiping capitalism, is that consumerism is good, and that there is no room for anything that kind of is lasting, or like kind of like that's why art is bad, right, and stuff, because it's kind of you're caring more about complicated feelings and things that are more enduring and stuff. It's more about like kind of snapping a selfie, like kind of, or things that like kind of are the here and now, that like we're this is what I'm consuming now in this moment.
Yeah, a pure sensation, rather a sort of a narrative that would go along with the experience. I mean, part of the thing he says, the reason why we're moving in this direction is because you need to, in order to, there is this sort of general trend towards stabilizing of society. So in order to stabilize society, you can't have big tragedies with heroes, because then you're creating too much sort of flux in the emotional state of the society. Likewise, you can't have great passionate sort of stories or love and everything like this, because basically you're going to make people sort of identify with the wrong way and not kind of have a more uniform experience, which is why nobody's allowed to read Shakespeare in Brave New World, because it has too many sort of strong feelings in it. You want to sort of have the easily consumable and easily manageable feelings in the society.
Right, and thus the feelies, right, where it's about, like you said, just the feeling, and because narrative kind of different times, there is a feeling that's what's, I think, ironic. Something that we talk about all the time is that, like, it's great if you have like a story with feeling, and you need a feeling and everything like that. But meanwhile, it always goes back to story, because and part of that though is a question, like in other words, it's not just simply the central character wanting something and stuff like that, but they also do along the way question, like, do I really want this? Why do I want this? How much do I want this? Like, there's all these kind of questions that come up as they kind of, are progressing towards this desire. And that's messy, in this, in like you said, a world that like things need to be stable and like kind of just, which is why, like, in like kind of a post-industrial era, you want just kind of people still trained for to keep the machines running, to keep the oil kind of things lubricated and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think it's this is why things like political opinions, while they're very sort of, I mean, this is his other interesting insight, is that he thinks that basically to have a completely sort of scientific and stable society, well, this is Bertrand Russell, not Aldous Huxley. I should clarify.
Right.
He says that actually, like the mechanics of politics have to become almost like a necessary evil and something that's kind of a sideline to keep people thinking there's a say in it, whereas actually in the background, society is being moved and engineered in a particular direction, which sounds quite conspiratorial. But you have to remember, this is him just going on what he sees as societal trends before technology, before conspiracy theories or anything else.
Right.
So he thinks that there are just these general trends that are just sort of we're in the interests of scientific rationality and stabilization. We're moving towards anyway, which I think is fascinating, because a lot of these things have come true, and without any kind of great engineering, So I mean, some of the other sort of stuff, he thinks artificial embryology is an inevitability, because we will desire to create humans that are more, more fitting. So he says that will kind of. He also thinks that corruption, things like this are often connected to familial ties, to things like this. So you can stabilize. The idea is to stabilize a society by having people less attached to their parents, because you have less sort of familial skin in the game, or less ability to sort of you're less willing to sort of have nepotism and pass these things on between your family as a result, if you break more of those kind of familial ties. So
yeah, I wonder. I mean, we have technology now, like, never mind, like, kind of, having mapped out the genome and stuff like that. But now we have CRISPR technology where we can actually, engineer things more than ever and stuff. Like it's the stuff that, again, was like sci-fi, that now here we are, 21st century, that like we have the technology, like, so that begs the question then, like, are we just going to, like you said, in some ways, just move naturally towards this world where we just basically, like, hey, you can order up, your kid having blue eyes and being 6 foot versus 5 foot, whatever, and I mean, is that just something that's going to just naturally happen and stuff?
Well, I think it will happen, but the idea is right now that sounds like a very kind of individualistic and selfish way of looking at designing your children.
Mm-hmm.
But if your social norms have all kind of coalesced around one, perfect human being, then actually designing your kid so that it fits in will actually become more the norm than having the natural variation. You'll actually want the kid to make sure that it's 6 foot and make sure that it's a certain intelligence. So I think over time you'll actually see, even though you can design your child however you want, you'll actually see them all kind of like coming to a common kind of shape and size and intelligence level.
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of said a little bit, that we do like kind of mistake some ways evolution as like kind of these different approaches and stuff, because certainly like just by natural selection, if you will, we have over time like like what's like kind of a good looking kid versus like a like what seems like a healthy attractive kid versus like less so, right, and stuff. And and then they tend to like kind of find or connect with other like kind of like kids and stuff. I mean, it's kind of like if you take high school for example, it's like almost like a natural petri dish for selection, natural selection, and like kind of kind of them sorting themselves into castes, and like totally. So I guess that's what's funny is that like on the one hand we're kind of like talking about a artificially created society and stuff, and the problems that come with it, and then how it ends up being a dystopia. But yet when you go into a high school different times, kids like kind of just as much as like Lord of the Flies will organize themselves or deorganize themselves, towards one way or another, depending on how much parental guidance they're getting. And then, never mind like kind of the extreme cases of mass shootings and stuff like that, but just different times, like, you kind of mentioned on the other episode about how like, your daughter kind of contending with like, the other kids and like kind of the pressures and so.
They do it, yeah. Definitely, there's the desire to sort of develop their own pecking order. And speaking in which, in terms, I mean, the scientific outlook doesn't really specify particular castes or stratification. It does say, though, a bit like H.G. Wells in The Time Machine, there will be two kind of like, there'll be one race that's sort of doing this and another race that's almost engineered for particular tasks.
Right.
Now, I think Aldous Huxley took that and added what his knowledge of maybe Indian society, which has a very stratified caste system, and even describes it as a caste system in Brave New World.
Yes.
And I mean, the knowledge of that, from my knowledge, is that it's almost like you can look at people's surnames and see what their roles were and their jobs were.
Right.
And so it's a very kind of interesting background. And I'm not an expert on it by any means, but it's interesting to see that kind of. I think that was where he got the inspiration for the Alpha to Epsilon, but also probably his experience of public school and having to gone to. I think he went to Oxford or Cambridge.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. I mean, like coming from Britain and stuff like that, I have to kind of wonder, like like how you kind of view things, because even though I was educated in the States, and like kind of the kind of ideal, if you will, of what you're the pitch that you're kind of told as a kid is like anybody can be president, that kind of thing and stuff like that. I'm guessing that like from your experience, that's not what a British child is told and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, the Alpha to Epsilon stuff is probably a product of being taught Latin in older English schools, and also the fact that's how you're graded, right? Most schools it's the same, but you get graded A, B, C, D, and E, and F.
Yeah.
And depending on where you grade determines where you get to the next one. So it's probably a mixture of either influenced by sort of India or just like the grading system in education, which, he came from a very academic and background. I mean, Aldous Huxley's brother is Julian Huxley, the sort of famous scientist who was very good friends with Bertrand Russell. So they were very much kind of contemporaries, but they weren't that close. But I think I have a feeling that Bertrand Russell kind of felt like Aldous kind of ripped him off a little bit with Brave New World, because there is so many shared ideas. He even talks about private sentiment and attach will be viewed with suspicion because it removes you from the societal body, which is kind of what you can also say that, maybe even Nazi Germany was like that. Maybe if you were too much of a private person, you would be viewed with suspicion there. Basically he talks about drug-induced control of, with conditioning, and talks about, drugs with no after effects or hangover, exactly like soma. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff. He talks about the decline of classical literature, fostering submissiveness in the interest of social stability, taming man's destructive influences. And I guess not meaning to sort of go on too much about Bertrand Russell stuff, but he talks about how basically stuff that we would look for ourselves to generate would gradually be taken over by the states. So we would look to Hollywood for our entertainment, banking for credit rather than generating our own sort of wealth, and government for healthcare and rather than private doctors. So yeah.
Well, what about sex though too? Like where like China had the one child policy, right? Like kind of, I mean, that's as far as I know. Like some governments have had some kind of legislation around kind of like children and that kind of thing and stuff like that. But that was like the first explicit one, and I just kind of have to wonder too, like kind of like here in overall in Brave New World, right? Like now, in their world, people don't have sex for other than just to kind of burn off their desires, I guess, and stuff. And it's interesting again how like this is like 1930s that they had this vision, because other than the flappers and stuff, they hadn't seen anything like remotely like this, the sex, the revolution in the 70s and stuff like that, because there wasn't the birth control pill yet and stuff. So, but yet they kind of just pictured in some ways like what was to come.
Yeah, I mean, and let's not forget that the one-child policy is very much like a society trying to engineer its reproduction. Yeah. And likewise, the other thing, the Freemartins that he talks about in Brave New World, they, if you've ever read Midnight's Children, that's a sort of a semi-fictionalized version of the truth, in that you had, I think it was Indira Gandhi was sterilizing homeless people in order to sort of try and control that. Yeah. So definitely these things they have been tried. Yeah, I mean, and he actually he sort of does mention that, the idea that they'll be trying to sort of control reproduction and things like this in societies. I mean, what's interesting as well is that he talks about how various people in history will be viewed as dangerous or destabilizing. And you'll notice that like there is a lot of mention of Malthus in Brave New World and Malthusian kind of contraception, because Malthus was about how to organize your populations. But there's no mention of Darwin, because the idea of sort of evolution and adaptation is obviously a destabilizing influence. So Aldous Huxley goes to great lengths to talk about Malthus and not Darwin.
Because Darwin's about natural selection, right? And this is artificial selection.
Artificial selection, yeah, totally.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, I didn't pick up on that, so yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. The other thing he described, which was kind of like one of the last bits of Bertrand Russell's thing, is he describes an idealist as either a lunatic or power hungry. One with the intent to create, the other with the intent to escape. And he says the elites will, and this I think is very relevant to modern times. He says, the national leaders will become like the Merovingian kings, become lazy and hand control over to the technical experts or the scientists. He puts it in the terms of scientists, but I think we're actually living that out now, where the elites have kind of become lazy, and it's basically like your technology companies that are now driving, how the world progresses and how culture and society is moving forward, whilst we're watching the sideshow of like which Democrat or Republican gets into power. I can't help feeling this is something we're looking at. But Yeah, I mean, to put Brave New World in Aldous Huxley's own words from the Huxley and Huxley documentary that you sent to me, he describes it as a self-inflicted dehumanization by our technological and scientific advances, which is, a very kind of good nutshell review of his own book, really, there.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like, one of the things I'm kind of getting from our discussion overall is that, like, on the one hand, like, here we're talking about a world that was artificially, architected and, kind of created and stuff like that. But the other, I feel like in real life, what's happening is that, like, we're kind of heading different ways in that direction by, there is no kind of, invisible hand. There is no mastermind and stuff like that. It's just happening,
Yeah. I think it's a natural sort of trend towards a stabilization of various different forces and ideologies and various other things. But yeah, it's I think what's interesting for me about Brave New World and why it's so separate from a lot of Aldous Huxley's other novels is that it's I don't think he did another sci-fi novel except for Island, which is his sort of one of his final novels where he tried to sort of make a counterpoint, no pun intended for his earlier novel, but anyway, this was his kind of utopia versus his dystopia,
right?
But it's nowhere near as interesting a novel. It's basically kind of like, I mean, it's interesting, but it's more like a kind of return to nature. It's kind of like a hippie colony, but,
right.
With more thought behind it, kind of, and with more indigenous kind of traditions thrown into the mix.
And I guess that's the thing, right? By nature, that, like, if you have a perfect world, then there really isn't much room for things, conflict or things to kind of really, that go counter to individual desires and stuff. Versus a dystopia, right? Then, like, kind of by its very nature, the individual is oppressed. So then, like, kind of the one or two that kind of decides, like, I'm going to go my own way. That's automatically conflict right there, unless things are humming along and, like, that they're just kind of oppressed and stayed oppressed, right? As we talked about with the Epsilons and stuff like that, as they would in real life versus, what happens in the series and stuff. So I think that's the thing that's kind of ironic is that, like, a dystopia naturally creates stories, and then a utopia would naturally not create much story and stuff.
Yeah, it's more like an addendum to Brave New World than an actual self-contained story, I would say. But also, I think it speaks to the fact that he got a lot of the ideas from the Bertrand Russell paper.
Okay.
But ultimately, I think Aldous Huxley is actually is a satirical writer, really,
right.
And that's really how I view a lot of his stuff. But and the other major contradiction, of course, in Brave New World is that he criticizes the talkies as feelies. And, he says that they're using drugs to control the population, but then goes on to become a screenwriter for Hollywood and experiments with mescaline. So it's kind of like he's just gone completely in the opposite direction from what he sort of wrote about in that one. But it's I guess the other criticism I would say of both of these things is the decanting whole thing, the idea of babies in bottles, I mean, it's a very sort of fun thing to put in a dystopian novel, but I mean, from what I understand, it wouldn't work because human children, there was like some ludicrously cruel experiment done by some Russian king where they separated newborns from any kind of physical contact and they all just died, basically. So I don't know that it would have to be some very, very sophisticated technology to replace, human contact, I think. But
even like the Skinner experiments kind of reinforced that. Like they showed like baby chimps that kind of without any kind of contact. Even if it's like kind of a robot, right, that has some kind of padding, I guess, and stuff. That's what's funny. Like it can be artificial, and yet like we just have a need for contact and stuff. That's just something that is a very basic kind of to I guess at least. Mammals and stuff.
Oh, totally. Yeah. No, I think there's a little bit more to it than we can build in a lab at the moment. But I mean, also we're talking about Skinner. I mean, this is a very sort of simplistic version of conditioning that they're using. It's all kind of Pavlovian and the hypnopedic kind of versions.
We didn't get into too much detail, but yeah, it was very like kind of like the shocking and that kind of thing and stuff of the children.
Yeah, I mean they represented that pretty well in the 2020 version.
That's true.
I can't remember if they included it in the 1980s.
No, it did seem like there was really I think what's funny is that like when you hire kids, it's definitely like kind of Hollywood has this kind of saying about like never work with children and animals and stuff because like there's a huge overhead that kind of comes up. And again, I guess the 2020 series that like they were just sparing no expense, so I think they were like kind of willing to go there. But the other ones, they kind of I think were really tight budgets, and they're like we don't really need this. We can just talk about it, and that'll be enough.
Yeah, and I mean one of the most controversial things in the book, I would say, that isn't in any of the TV or movie ones is this idea of prepubescent sexualizing of children becoming a normal thing. And I mean that is you're not going to see that in terms of but I mean that's that was a very interesting kind of conclusion that Aldous Huxley came to, because Bertrand Russell certainly doesn't mention that in the Scientific Outlook, but it does make you wonder what where he drew that conclusion from, why that would be an inevitability for society. Yeah. And I mean, it's weird in that we already kind of see that a little bit on the more risque stuff with TikTok and, there was that series on Netflix that was criticized for the 8-year-old.
The French girls,
who were sort of seen in either in their underwear or something, or topless or something. Which people complained about, but it didn't really have any impact on subscriber rates. So it's interesting to see if that becomes sort of more acceptable over time, because that's a pretty disturbing trend if ever there was one. And it's referenced as just kind of like innocent play in Brave New World, or as like sort of preparation. It'd be really interesting to know what kind of sparked that, because and
on the other hand too, like even though like like you said, there was the backlash against that Friends series. It was actually called Cuties and stuff.
That's it,
that even though there was that backlash, but let's face it though, like it's if you see like kind of the advertising and like kind of just often how girls are like sexualized at a very young age, like they're basically shown to put on makeup and like. I mean, it's really like kind of a fine line to what you as a parent or individual decides is appropriate, and what is like kind of different times. The kids are basically, I don't know about pressure to, but they're at least like kind of shown that like, oh, it's okay. If not, I feel like the pressure probably comes from just a general kind of typical peer pressure kind of thing. But I feel like that because it's shown as, oh, this is the way it is and stuff like that. Like there was the one girl from Stranger Things, and like she like kind of different times, like they had her done up in like kind of these different things and stuff, and a lot of heavy makeup, and I feel like it just kind of just the way it's portrayed. It's not necessarily even like kind of anybody saying like like oh kind of young girls should be more like women right away and stuff like that, but it's just kind of what's I think just again what we've naturally kind of gone towards and stuff.
Yeah, which is very disturbing, really. But I mean, I think the way that you can see, I think I've figured out how he arrived at that conclusion, and that is that when you think about it in terms of how they deal with death in Brave New World, they condition children from a very young age to deal with death, as that's seen as a sort of an essential part of the society, and promiscuity and lack of parental attachment is seen as an essential part of their society. So it actually makes sense to condition them from a young age towards promiscuity. So I can see how it makes sense in the book. How it makes sense in why we're moving in that direction in society at large, I don't know. But
and we have like kind of probably the two sides about like of when kids should have sex education and stuff in schools. And there's those who like say like kind of you can start introducing them at a younger age and stuff, and but I guess it's like kind of it's like either the kids are gonna find out, and like nowadays what's on the internet and stuff is so readily available, or we're going to basically take the time to kind of explain like, okay, this is what happens, I kind of, so I guess that's the thing, like, it's either they're going to find it on their own, like kind of when they go to their friend's place and, like kind of, the friend has, doesn't have restricted internet, or we're going to, educate them at whatever age in school,
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible what kids, hang out. I mean, like my daughter was talking about like Candyman and Annabelle and, horror movies that some kid somewhere has seen or seen a bit of. And, then that becomes like the thing they all want to talk about.
Right.
It's,
as kids do, like that, like kids will talk. I mean, that's their nature.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. And I mean, and that comes back to this idea of, your peer pressure, your place in society, and what function that actually plays, in that there's this kind of idea that, the point Huxley makes pretty heavily is that you need to have time alone and independent time in order to reflect, to be creative, to collect your thoughts, to get in touch with a kind of a higher truth, if anything, a spirituality, which is obviously, the opposite of what's, dictated in the Brave New World society.
And in modern society with like, the idea of like, you should always be online, you should always have your social media, on and stuff and be engaging with it.
Yeah. But I mean, in a way, it's the other counter to that, though. He makes the point that John is very much isolated in the book, and it's to his own detriment. So it's not a natural state for people to be completely isolated.
Right.
But likewise, if your only concern is with society and what society wants, you're missing out on some of the sort of the deeper meanings of life and that own sort of personal reflection and journey. So yeah, it's an interesting one, that in terms of how he dictated it. But I mean, I also thought it was interesting that both him and actually Bertrand Russell see the future as somewhere where religion is seen as smut. I think it describes it as religion as smut, instinct is madness, and and then
I tell you that's actually been some of the left wing, kind of approach and stuff like that. And the counter to it, of course, has been the rise of a Donald Trump that, basically, professes to be like kind of, like he's, doing photo ops, right, with the Bible and stuff like that. And, so he symbolizes like kind of, the return to religion. And so he's getting voted out. So then, so the people are going to, the conservatives are going to argue that like, oh, it's the, this death of kind of, our beliefs and kind of, it's kind of the liberals kind of, basically shooting religion out the window again and stuff like that. And of course, you and I know that that's not, really what's really happening and stuff. But it's like kind of that's kind of like in some ways what, is being played out as a narrative of what's going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is interesting that does seem to be the modern sort of materialist interpretation that there's no place for any kind of scientific exploration or even questioning of anything that isn't completely kind of an atheist outlook. But yeah, the other thing I thought was really interesting that completely sort of blew my mind coming back to this again was that I remember reading Brave New World and them talking about travel by rocket.
Oh, right.
And like, I read that in like the late 90s and I thought, well, that was, that along with newspapers and cigarettes, he got that a bit wrong. But then, of course, now we have Tesla saying that, he's going to challenge things by doing Atlantic travel by rocket. So that was pretty crazy. And also, sorry,
I was going to say in the series, though, the way they seem to portray it is that Britain apparently is post-Brexit, and like that's like kind of the modern society stuff, and apparently the United States is going to end up being the savage lands that amusement park and stuff that they rocket to.
Yeah, I mean that's if England continues to become some sort of liberal heartland or something, which I'm not sure is exactly true. But yeah, it's an interesting why they chose it to do it that way.
Right.
Yeah, I mean it's a bit like sort of Margaret Atwood with *Handmaid's Tale*. It's another sort of fairly grim view of America's future. But who knows? The results are still pouring in as we record this, so we'll find out soon. Yeah, so obviously it's not perfect, his prediction, but yeah, I mean, I thought the other interesting modern kind of thing that's happening is this idea of destroying statues and censoring history in the name of kind of being fair to particular people or bringing to light past injustices. But I mean, it's kind of the idea of destroying it is kind of a bit worrying. That's kind of Brave New World, in that I would say, let's just take those statues and put them in a exhibit that these are the evil people of history, rather than just trying to eradicate them from history altogether.
The part that bothers me the most about that is it's basically rewriting history. Never mind 1984, but it's the same thing that like we basically, in theory, fought fascism and socialism. Like we fought the fascists, won the war. We had the Cold War, fought the socialists, right, and stuff, to go very much against this very thing of like rewriting history and everything. And what do? We tear down statues, and we kind of we're just basically doing the same thing.
But also it goes towards this trend of kind of emotional stabilization of a society. These things are too difficult for us to deal with on a daily basis. So easier just to get rid of them so that we can all live on a much more level. That's the sort of worrying thing about this, is this sort of idea that we can't handle the truth, in the words of Jack Nicholson,
Yeah.
And I mean, I would much rather there be a kind of like, rather than just not showing Gone with the Wind, you have like a discussion beforehand, or there's something. Don't try and kind of hide it.
And this gets to one of the core things that we haven't really talked about yet. I think we've kind of mentioned a little bit offline, is how much do we want a government or anything to be like a parent, right? Like it's that's really like kind of what I feel like kind of is really the most troubling thing about the trends of whether it's left wing or right wing, conservatives, liberals and stuff, is that like both sides have this attitude that like we should have this benevolent parent that should basically be kind of guiding us as children along, us being people in general. And I feel like, to me, like that's kind of like what is promoted the most, kind of. And again, like never mind, like again, whether we go to extreme cases of like fascism, socialism, this is like even in this kind of, in theory, democratic modern society that we have now, that we still have this attitude that like that the people should be told when their coffee is too hot, otherwise like it's got to be on a label and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the moderation of life, that's what that's what these ways warning us against, I guess.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think the other sort of interesting thing with this is this idea that Mustapha Mond's exposition towards the end of the book, where he describes all the different reasons for why they've ended up in this particular place. Like he said, you had to create these casts of people in their different sections with intelligence levels that befitted the tasks.
Yeah.
Because what he found was that people in lower positions were constantly trying to get better ones, and the people in the best positions were just trying to stay there.
Right.
So it's kind of like, I thought that was a really interesting insight into, work and things like this.
Yeah.
And that whenever there was a war or crisis, it meant that people were happy to have their lives controlled by the scientists, which is, again, is just like a, great insight into how we deal with modern problems. So, there's a lot of stuff that you just read it and you think, oh my God, where are we going to end up? Although if we end up with centrifugal bumble puppy as a sport, then I would say bring it on. I love that term. I've no idea how that game works, but I'd love to see someone actually build a centrifugal bumble puppy machine to play that sport. But yeah. And of course the songs like Hug Me Till You Drug Me, Kiss Me Till I'm in a Coma, Love's As Good As Soma, I can't wait for that. That's
that definitely kind of really has this 30s kind of what's called jazz kind of song to feel to it and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's what's interesting for me is that Aldous Huxley, on a more personal note, was very, very influential on me after I read Brave New World. And as I say, I read all of his books, and I can't help kind of feeling that in a way I've lived my life almost a little bit by the concepts of Brave New World, in that I was working in the UK and I kind of felt like a cog in a machine, and I was trying to sort of work my way up. And so I decided to, much like Helmholtz Watson and what eventually happens to Bernard Marx, escape to an island where I can remove myself from society and try and sort of find some sort of place of self-reflection. So that was really, really odd.
Well, at least you didn't have like trails of people following you along until it drove you mad and kind of made you want to off yourself and stuff. So
yeah, true. Yeah, I haven't jumped off any cliffs yet.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I had a good friend as well who was read a lot of Bertrand Russell, and if you know, Bertrand Russell had a very kind of liberal view of sex and marriage, and he was married about 4 times. And I don't think it's any coincidence that my friend was also pretty promiscuous as well. So and he was reading about the same time. So I almost wonder if we both kind of went on, paths very much dictated by what we read.
Well, I mean, that's part that, the Brave New World definitely got right, is that books are dangerous and stuff. And, but at the same time, I feel like, thank goodness for, a little bit of danger and stuff like that. And I think, if nothing else that I take out of all this too is that like, and maybe it's like, to kind of wrap it up a little bit for our discussions, that like, I think that, these different, whether it's the books or the movies, stuff like that, I feel that like, if nothing else, it's the importance of it is to have these ideas and to like explore, to ask the questions like Lenina and everything. I'm not saying by any means do we have the answers, because it seems like, as we kind of seem to be concluding, people in society will kind of trend towards, what they trend towards and everything. And there's only so much that any of us can do. But I think as long as we as individuals, just like John, kind of at least, look back at to some degree to the Shakespeare's and the, classic works, and kind of meanwhile, ask these questions, then we at least stand some chance and stuff, I guess.
No, it's not, as I say, it's as they sort of talk about, as the John character says in all the various different versions, it's the unhappiness and some of the trauma and the difficulty things that actually make us sort of experience some of the more wider spectrum of life. So
with that, I think we'll sign off.
Been a bit of a Leviathan video, this one. So,
and coming up, we'll have some lighter kind of stuff. We'll be watching Shall We Dance? So we're going back to Japan, but on a much lighter note than the horror series that we kind of experienced and stuff. And then we'll start diving into some holiday pictures, including Bishop's Wife. And so once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you at the movies.